Keep the coronavirus lockdowns and save lives, or end the coronavirus lockdowns and save lives? This is the question dividing America this week, while both sides of this debate pray for a good outcome. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana paraphrased it quite well when he compared it between the choice between having a heart attack or having cancer. Americans want neither. Americans want to survive and to prosper. Day by day, there are signs that the patient is in gradual recovery and that the USA is on the mend. At the same time, there are signs that our society is fraying at the edges. 22 million have filed for unemployment benefits. Thousands of families in cars waiting for food at drive-through food lines from Florida to California. And of course, fights over toilet paper in the aisles of supermarkets. In Michigan, where 30,000 have caught the virus and 2,000 have died, tense street protests on the state capitol steps in Lansing against Governor Gretchen Whitmer for her strict lockdown. Protests in Texas, North Carolina, Oregon, and California. More in Arizona, Pennsylvania, and even in the pandemic epicenter, New York, with a death toll nearing 14,000. Americans are demanding to go back to work. In the background, a nationwide release of countless prisoners. The closure of food plants in Colorado and South Dakota and Iowa, as thousands test positive for the virus. President Trump is fighting to put a hopeful face on the pandemic, knowing that if we were to let it overwhelm us, America as we know it could be lost. The cure more dangerous than the virus. His man at CDC, Dr. Fauci, is walking a thin line between Trump's hope and scientific reality, while both men pray for the same result. America is moving forward, one step at a time. Inevitably, we will survive COVID-19, but what will the world be like when it's over? While we are all rightly focused on events at home, events beyond our shores will affect our lives as well. Changing circumstances with America's adversaries will affect the lives of millions of Americans in ways that are difficult to focus on right now. Hello and welcome. I'm John Jordan and you're watching This Will Happen. Joining us today is Victor Davis Hanson, a renowned author and military historian and author of numerous books, including The Second World Wars and A War Like No Other. Dr. Hanson is also a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institute. Welcome, Victor, and welcome to the show. Well, Victor, Americans are obviously focused on what's going on at home. Americans aren't yet focused on what's going on yet beyond our shores and how the virus is going to affect our adversaries and how the world chessboard is modified going forward. I rather suspect that this is going to have a significant impact and is going to change the dynamics of our relationships.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. If we look at the four countries that nominally, at least people think of our chief adversaries, China, Russia, of course, North Korea, and Iran, I don't think they come off too well. We were already in a oil price war that was destroying the Russian economy because it's not diversified like ours. And we don't know what the effect of the virus has on Putin because he hasn't given us any information. North Korea is locked down. It was under a trade embargo. It was hurting anyway, and it was dependent on Chinese capital to survive. That's not working out too well. Iran had popular protest. It had, remember, it had shot down the airliner. It had a lot of public relations problems. It hasn't done well with the virus. It's Chinese patron. There's a lot of tension there, given that China did to the Iranians what it did to us. It wasn't transparent about its citizens flying in at a time of infection. Then we get to China, and it was in this trade war with us. And I think a lot of people, if you talk to them in private and not in a partisan context, they felt that we were starting to win and China was starting to lose. There was the Hong Kong protests. There were all these news accounts of their re-education camps that were coming out, and then the virus. I think for all of their backtracking and everything, and you're also hearing a lot of stories from financiers and business people that they're receiving warnings from the Chinese government. If they were to decouple, they would not be compensated for their factories or their capital or even their bank accounts. So I have a feeling they're really hurting and they're very worried about the future.
With a lot of countries becoming more reticent to do business in China, even if there's a lot of shoe leather costs or sunk costs for a lot of companies heavily invested there, investment in China is going to decelerate in a very profound fashion. And that would have significant economic ramifications for China domestically. And does this jeopardize the primacy of the CCP?
Well, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think you're absolutely right that it's the most existential threat that the party's faced since its creation, because you start to hear these stories that are people screaming and yelling at provincial officials, and this Belt and Road or the Silk Road Initiative you hear that the African countries are irate because of endemic racism toward their own citizens in China, and they're not either economically equipped or they're not willing to honor a lot of the payments that are due for infrastructure investment. There's a lot of people in Europe that feel that one way of getting even with the Chinese might be to retard or slow down or default on some of the payments for the infrastructure investments. So China's looking at economic problems, social problems, and political problems. I think a lot of people that I've talked to in government and out are very wary about decoupling. They all want to decouple pharmaceuticals and medical supplies and rare earths and military technology, but they want to sort of back out of the saloon firing with their six guns. They don't want China to, right now in the middle of this crisis, cut off ventilator sales or mask sales until we're up and running. And then more importantly, they've got hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in China. I think that's even affected Donald Trump when people get very angry at him, because now and then he'll toss a little bone to China and say, well, I just talked to Xi on the phone and we had a good talk. But I think he's sort of art of the deal negotiating that you don't cut off an adversary who has his hand over your throat still, and they still do in key industries. Out of this tragedy, there is some unexpected good news, and that is that across the political spectrum, there's emerging a united view of China. If you're a liberal and you're worried about human rights and you look at the re-education camps, then you have no problem with decoupling. If you're a old-fashioned hardcore conservative that likes Taiwan and you were always skeptical of the communists, you have no problem. If you're business people who were globalist and you see what the Chinese are doing to you and what doing business with China does to your reputation, then you're starting to come along as well. So
this national consensus to be tough on China, would it be fair to say that it is one of the ironies of history that it's organized labor and some of the chief enemies of President Trump which are kind of making possible this change in the political battlefield, which ultimately could benefit him in November?
Trump saw that in 2015, and that's one of the ways he harvested a lot of Democratic blue-collar workers by playing the China card in a way that people in the Democratic Party had talked about, but they hadn't really done anything. He has an animal cunning, a prescience about a lot of things that people don't give him credit for. If you just look at 3 or 4 issues about border security that he hammered during the election in the first years of his presidency, he said we're going to have a travel ban against Nigeria and Iran and Libya and North Korea and any country in the Middle East that can't verify their passport control. And that sort of paved the way for the travel ban he used against China. End of life use of off-label drugs, that was pretty controversial in 2018. The FDA didn't like that. But that sort of was a precursor to the promotion of hydroxychloroquine as well. So there, and then of course the whole China idea, he was there before anybody. And you mentioned the November election. If they start running ads with Joe and Hunter Biden getting off the plane in China, it's not going to be, I mean, that's what we should expect that Trump will do.
Moving on to Iran. Obviously, Iran was a country whose economy was in very dire straits even before the coronavirus hit. The Iranian economy essentially in free fall with unrest throughout the country. Now you have here the mullahs weren't exactly forthright with their people, as is the case with China. And you have a country with the largest percentage of its people born after 1979 of any other OECD country. How does this all play out for the mullahs and the Iranian regime?
Well, I'm kind of worried in a little bit because I feel that the getting out of the Iran deal was wise, and the stepped up embargo, and then the falling oil prices, and then all of these other things that were perfect storm disasters for Iran. But in their view, it's not sustainable. And they know that. And the Trump administration will not relent. And they know Pompeo will not relent, the Secretary of State. And it's sort of analogous to North Korea and China. And so with regimes like this that realize they're not going to be appeased, or they're not going to suddenly say, you know, people are eating grass in North Korea, call off the sanctions, or maybe we will, you know, promise not to use, not develop nuclear weapons for 10 years or 15, as the Iranians said. That's not going to work with this administration. So I would expect as we get into July and August and September and October, we're going to see some provocative move by any of the four of them. They really do not want this administration to get elected. And we've already seen a little bit of it. There was a report in Reuters the other day that a lot of Iranian boats were harassing, they weren't very big boats, they were speedboats, harassing US Navy vessels in the Persian Gulf. There were stories that China may have broken the no-yield nuclear ban on testing weapons. They're going to have to do something because the trajectory they're all on is not going to be good for them.
And Iran perhaps to try to create a political environment that would change the economic trajectory that they're on. With regard to Iran, I want to try this out with you. Iran seems to want to bait the United States. There are small little provocations. It is almost as if, to me, it appears that they wish for a massive U.S. response, something where they could point to, you know, dead Iranians, something they could turn into a la North Vietnam or some sort of propaganda victory to change the dynamics inside of Europe and the United States to where they might get some concessions if they can make the United States do something which the rest of the world regards excessive. Do you see it that way?
I do, and I think that Barack Obama, when they shot down a drone, he didn't do anything. He didn't even try to destroy the drone. He didn't do anything when they hijacked an American ship. So in their way of thinking, going back to '79, the United States just doesn't do anything. I think what we're seeing, because their cash is cut off to Hamas, Hezbollah, all of these terrorist groups in Syria, Lebanon, and on the West Bank, that they're going to get pretty desperate.
And once you start to deprive them of resources and oxygen, the rest of the Middle East may be on a better path. Iran's role there was far more malignant than people realized. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it is. I think one of the dividends of what Pompeo and Trump are doing is that a lot of countries in the Middle East privately, when you talk to their representatives or their media, they'll tell you they have no problem with Israel, but they can't say that publicly. And they're scared to death of Iran because they feel Iran is unpredictable, crazy, and capable of stirring up Shia underclasses in some of these major Arab countries. But when the United States acted against Soleimani and keeps the sanctions on, then that emboldens them to be a little bit more muscular in support of us, and they don't really play up the, you know, anti-Israeli rhetoric the way they used to. And I remember maybe a couple of years ago, some diplomat and media person combined came to the Hoover Institution, and he said to me, "Tell your friends in America that if the Israelis ever want to take out these nuclear facilities in Iran, the Saudis have as many cruise missiles as they need. We'll give them to you for free, and we'll let you go use our airspace anywhere you want." And he wasn't a very high-ranking person, but I think that reflected the idea, the cynical idea in the Arab world.
Well, Iran is really the hinge point then of events in the Middle East. If you're able to deprive Iran of either the motivation or the means, the Arab world is almost on a path to peace with Israel. We're also seeing a budding relationship between a lot of the Gulf states and Israel, as Iran is seen as the primary problem and as an existential threat to both sides.
Yeah, that was the tragedy of the Obama administration. That was a natural development that was occurring, and the Obama administration, for some reason, had this bizarre idea that it was going to empower Iran by infusing billions of dollars after this deal was signed, and maybe it would bring social justice or equilibrium and to the Shia underclass or the Iranians or the Persians, whatever bizarre idea they had as a check against the Saudis, but events overtook all of that. Once it was kind of like the emperor has no clothes. Once Trump said the deal is naked, it's a joke, and he got out of it. Rioting didn't happen. Nothing happened. There was no response except that Iran was in bad shape because their revenue stream was cut off. And then Trump was basically letting natural developments, and that was the U.S. became the largest producer of gas and oil in the world. It may be soon the largest exporter if it isn't already. And there were countries in the world that couldn't blackmail us anymore. And the Middle East lost its relative importance vis-a-vis, say, Asia. Before we knew it, Arabs were kind of saying, if you just let things happen and not talk about the Palestinians, it'll resolve itself slowly. The real problem is Iran. And I don't know why we didn't, in the Obama years, we did not want to be receptive to that message. And Trump turns out to be very receptive to it.
The Chinese have a complicated relationship with North Korea. China does not want a unified Korean peninsula under Seoul. China does not want open armed conflict on the Korean peninsula. At the same time, China can't afford a collapse of the North Korean regime. So China has a vested interest in using North Korea as a leverage with the United States in trade negotiations because they understand its political import to us. It's a complicated game, and eventually, like musical chairs, eventually the music has to stop here, right?
Yeah, they remind me, I live out here in Fresno County on a farm, and I reminded a neighbor about 20 years ago whose kids would pick on my children, and every once in a while he would cut one of his 5 pit bulls loose, and they would, run over here about 600 yards, and then you'd go over and confront him, and he played the Chinese role, and the pit bulls were the North Korean. He said, "What? I don't know what's going on." "Oh, they're bothering you?" And then he had sort of a smirk on his face. And he played that game. Then finally, I shot one of them, and they stopped. But that's how North Korea and China function. That China would say, "We can't control North Korea. They're crazy too. They worry us." And then they would tell North Korea it's time to let off a missile over Japan, or say something crazy. And then they were able to leverage us and say, "You know what? You have allies that are nuclear, but we don't. And so this is our way of doing it." And I don't think that's going to be. All of what we're talking about depends on a financially solvent, growing, confident China that can either buy influence or bully its way into a global hegemony. And I don't think that's at all certain anymore. Relationships, it's sort of like cutting an octopus's head off, and the tentacles in Iran and North Korea and all over the world, Belt and Road, they flop around because the central nervous system is under attack.
North Korea is obviously in dire economic straits. Nobody really knows how prevalent the virus is there and what it's doing to North Korean society. Nor do we really have that much visibility right now into what's going on in China. How does this play out for North Korea, and how does China handle North Korea, because as North Korea is utterly dependent on Chinese patronage?
Yeah, North Korea shut its border with China in fear of the virus, and that was at a time when it was being embargoed and sanctioned and had no other source but Chinese capital to keep it alive. And what it was making by nuclear proliferation, say with the Iranians, that's cut off, because Iran has no money. And they understand now that the United States confronted North Korea, that these tough sanctions will not be lifted. If we all stay united, this regime is not sustainable. And especially at a time when its patron, China, is got financial worries of its own, as well as its bad reputation about lying to not just its enemies like us, but lying to its friends like North Korea about the severity of the outbreak.
Something we like to do in every show is talk about what will happen. So I'm going to give you a question. Great tensions in this country between protesters in Michigan lobbying for the opening up of America. Eventually, this is going to end. This crisis will pass. What can we expect America and our body politic to look like in the 90 days after people start to go back to work and the economy begins its recovery?
Yeah, I think ultimately that will be answered not by Donald Trump or the governors, but by the people. And by that I mean we can we can open everything up and we can say, just wear a mask or it will be social distancing. But ultimately, the people have to decide whether they're going to go out to eat, whether they're going to go to a theater, whether they're going to book a flight, whether they're going to go on a cruise, whether they're going to have people over their home for dinner, whether they're going to get in an Uber or Lyft. And that's 30 or 40% of the economy. And that has to happen. And the only thing that will make people to choose to do all those things, that is a fully normal economy, they have to be assured that the situation is underhand and it's something that they've dealt with before without the severity of this lockdown. And I think translated, that would mean if we get these millions of antibody tests, something like the Santa Clara Stanford study that shows the denominator of cases is vastly underestimated, and it might be 10, it might be 20. In their case, in Santa Clara, there was 55 to 85 times more people that had been exposed to it. And if that turns out to be pretty much 80 or 90% immunity, then people can say, you know what, the real lethality rate of this flu, although it's deadly and scary and horrible for people with medical issues, especially over time, but the fact of the matter is, it's not 3% lethality to case rate. It's more like, not 3 in 100, but 1 or 2 in 1,000. And we've dealt with that, we, the Americans, and in 2017 and 2009 to a lesser extent, but 1957, and we did things, but we did not shut down the country, because we're at the point now where if we continue past May, I think we're going to start to see some horrific news accounts of people dying from canceled medical procedures that were considered quote unquote optional, from everything from missed appointments to oncologists, cardiologists. So it's not money versus lives, it's lives versus lives. And I think once the antibody tests show us that a lot of these models were not just off, but were pernicious in that they were embraced by politicians who made catastrophic decisions and based on a denominator that we had never used before, that is only dividing into the fatalities the number of people who tested positive. If we had done that in 2017 and said we think there's 60,000 dead from the flu, we'll divide it by all the people who tested positive for the flu, it would have been a 10% lethality rate rather than 1 in 1,000. So we never do that, but we did it this time, and I think that was a mistake.
Thank you so much, Victor. It was great to have you here. Thank you so much for your time, and we hope that you'll come back soon.
I hope so too, John. Keep well and keep safe.
I will, you too.
Okay, see you guys.
And as for the American economy and the recovery of our businesses, Dr. Hanson said it quite well when he said it's up to us. It's up to us to go and support our neighbors' businesses. It's up to us to go out to dinner. It's up to us to reclaim our lives. Here, we embrace the challenge of looking into an uncertain future and divining world events before they happen, so that we can talk about them confidently and say, this will happen. Thank you for joining us, and remember that respect, freedom, and prosperity are for everyone. We'll see you next time.